Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And indeed, Jesus has impacted the world for good more than any person who has ever lived. And Jesus said to his followers, "You are the light of the world." A city on a hill cannot be hidden. So let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven. Jesus' vision for his followers was that they might be a light just as he had been a light in Capernaum as he healed those there and taught people about the kingdom of God. And it seems that Jesus' plan for his disciples to become this light to the world was to create little Jesuses who infiltrated every nook and cranny of society, and that everywhere they went, they would live the life of Jesus Christ and follow his teachings. That is, in fact, what a disciple is. Someone who imitates the teachings of a great rabbi or teacher and follows their way of life. Now, Jesus taught his disciples throughout his ministry, but one of the most famous body of teachings that is found is what is commonly referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And in the story of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes up on a mountainside and there he sits down, which was the normal teaching mode of a rabbi, and he begins to teach his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount begins with what is popularly referred to as the Beatitudes, which is about our approach or attitude towards life and the blessings that are found of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, when Jesus says those who follow his teachings are blessed, that is a word which refers to the good life. Those that follow Christ live the good life. But notice who it is that Jesus says is actually blessed. He says that those who are poor in spirit, the merciful, the meek, these are the ones who are blessed in this life. Now, Jesus also makes clear to his disciples that his disciples will in fact face trouble and persecution. But Jesus says those that follow him and are persecuted will receive their reward in heaven. And the early church did indeed face persecution. The Roman Emperor Nero burned down Rome and blamed Christians for it. Caligula took Christians and used them as lanterns, lighting them on fire. Christians were thrown into the lion's den and torn apart by lions. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught his disciples not to repay wrong with wrong. Instead, he taught his disciples to love those who persecuted them, to pray for them, to forgive them, to not take vengeance upon them. That if a soldier forced them to carry their things 1 mile, to go 2 miles instead. Jesus taught his disciples a different way of life and a different way to respond to the troubles and the cares and the persecutions of this world. And because of their way of life, because of their love and forgiveness and imitation of Jesus and his teachings, the world was changed and transformed, never to be made the same again. One historian, Rodney Stark, writes of the rise of early Christianity, and he details how the early church grew from a group of a few hundred to millions of people. In fact, the growth rate of the early church from the time of Jesus to the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who declared Christianity to be legal in AD 313, was 40% per decade. During this time, the early church grew tremendously by imitating the way of life of Jesus. Jesus valued and respected children and life, and so did the early church. In the first century, if a child was born and you did not want it, then you could abandon it up on the city walls up into age 2, and no one would call the police, no one would report you, because life had little value before Jesus Christ. But it was Christians who went and rescued those babies, most of whom, sadly, were baby girls. And they raised them as godly women. And when there was a shortage of eligible young women to marry in the Roman Empire, guess where the young men went? They married these Christian women, and many of them converted their husbands. The early church grew because, like Christ, they also took care of the sick and fed the hungry. One early church historian writes of an epidemic that hit the known world of that time. And he said that Christians were the only ones who took care of the sick, and many of them, in caring and nursing for others, lost their lives, gave up their lives in their stead. The early church also grew because it respected women and honored the institution of marriage, which gave women many legal rights and legal protections. The early church grew because it reached out to people of all backgrounds and all ethnicities, following Christ's great commission to go out and make disciples, make followers of all nations. And finally, the early church grew because Christians, imitating Jesus Christ, sacrificed their lives for others. After the Roman Emperor Constantine made Christianity legal, an emperor came after him named Julian, who only ruled for a short time. But Julian was a pagan, and he sought to turn the Roman Empire back to pagan gods and pagan religions. And he began to write letters to pagan priests, complaining, saying that Christians were not only taking care of their own sick and their own dead, but they were taking care of the pagans as well. And he said that everyone was going over to these Christians because of their acts of charity and benevolence. And so a program was begun to try to start some pagan charities. But of course, this program failed miserably, because at the heart of pagan religion are pagan gods. But at the heart of the Christian faith, at the heart of Christianity, is Jesus Christ, who gave up his life for others. Where did the early Christians get the idea that they ought to feed the hungry and heal the sick and take care of those in need and sacrifice their lives for others? It was, of course, from the life and example of Jesus Christ. There was an early 2nd century document called the Epistle of Mathetes, which is actually a letter written to a disciple about a disciple's way of life in the 1st century. And in this document, it says how Christians were distinguished not by the countries or cities that they lived in or were from, or their speech or their clothes, but instead they were distinguished by their way of life. Christians, it was said, married, as did others, but they did not devour their offspring. They had a common table, but not a common bed. They passed their days on earth, and yet are citizens of heaven. And to sum it up in one word, what the soul is to the body, so Christians are to the world. What this letter says is that Christians literally became the soul of the Roman Empire. They did this by living out the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So what about you? What do you think of this way of life that Jesus taught his followers? And how is it that you can be a light or blessing to those in your life?